Welcome to Wellness Spring. This episode with Dr. Matt Landos really shook me. What Matt reveals about our health and environment is staggering. We're eating plastic, breathing in chemicals, watching fertility and brain health decline, and most people have no idea. Matt shares how the government hasn't banned a single chemical in 30 years and what that means for you and your family. This is a must listen to episode. It's time to take your health in your own hands. The solution starts with what you decide to do next. Tune in now if you value your health, your family health, your pet, and the planet. Welcome, Matt, to Wellness Spring. It is so lovely to have you on the show.
Thanks for the invitation to chat, Beverley.
It's an absolute pleasure. And I'm very curious because you grew up on a dairy farm. Did you ever want to be a farmer?
Oh, well, actually, my original upbringing was in Canberra, and I was in suburbia at that time. And my father was, his role was in the Department of Agriculture, working with quarantine and the inspection service for Australia. So I had an interface with animal industries around Australia from a fairly young age. And I certainly had a passion for animals and working in animal industries as I grew up. I didn't get the opportunity to work with dairy farmers until I graduated from university as a veterinary scientist. They captured my attention as I'd moved through vet school as being a rather wonderful animal, quite an extraordinary animal for being so calm and placid, and yet at the same time being so immensely productive. Producing vast amounts of high quality milk. It was something that astonished me, and I got very deeply involved at the time in dairy production.
Wow. So I've learned something new today. And what is the difference? I'm sure everybody asks you this question between a conventional vet and a fish vet.
Well, look, the veterinary degree, as it's taught, is still a degree of comparative medicine, where we look initially starting often as a model with the dog, and then we start to look at other animals. So a cat is a dog that doesn't bark. A horse is a dog, but it's got less toes. We then observe across into other species, and we use these comparative medical techniques, and it's largely born out of really the evolutionary observation that animals are actually tremendously similar. They bear a lot of similarities to each other, and so we can carry across knowledge between species. We need to learn the differences as well, but often there's a core common body of knowledge that you're able to carry across. And so veterinary science is taught in this way as a comparative style of medicine. Now, when I went through veterinary school, which is quite some time ago now, I graduated back in '95, there was a very small component of one lecture that included content on fish. It wasn't a major feature. Veterinary degrees have updated since that time, and aquatic animals now do feature a slightly larger part of the degree, but still the minority. But fish were essentially a dog that was in water that didn't have fur on it. To carry on with the comparative style of analysis. And so my interest had actually, prior to the veterinary degree entry, been in aquatic ecosystems and in the health of those systems, how they operated, and trying to understand how they generated such immense productivity that could generate all this seafood that's consumed all the time. Now, as I went through my veterinary degree, I got somewhat distracted, some would say, into the dairy area, but then eventually found my way after several years of working in the dairy and mixed animal clinics back to work in fish again. So in around 2000, I took a job with the New South Wales state government, working in one of the agricultural institutes and a veterinary laboratory, where I had both a field component working with the development of aquaculture, as well as working with wild capture fisheries to understand why fish kills were occurring around the state, investigating those events and performing a lot of the laboratory analytics. So things like histopathology and microbiology were skills that I got to build upon whilst working at the lab there for 5 years. Since that time, I've been completely focused on aquatic life. So since 2000, I set up my own consultancy and have worked around Australia and in some international jurisdictions with both aquaculture of different species. So all things with gills tend to fall into the remit, but also into wild capture fisheries to understand where areas are productive or become unproductive, where there have been major mortality events. I've investigated some of those large-scale events.
Wow, you covered so much there. You mentioned at the end about mortality events. What exactly does that mean?
So some of those, Beverley, have been things like spray drift from agriculture, where
you hear
spray
me,
drift
Matt?
has... Yes. Yes, so when sometimes in fish populations or in aquatic ecosystems as a whole, we see a mass mortality, very large numbers of animals dying around a very short period of time. And these are very prominent events because there's often lots of floating corpses that are in the water. They attract a lot of public attention, often due to bad odour, but also people being concerned, obviously, that there's a lot of dead fish in the water. Now, some of these events have been localised on farming enterprises. One of them back in 2008-9 involved a fish hatchery. This particular one was producing fingerlings to restock into some of our dams, where the dam infrastructure has stopped the passageway for fish to populate these areas. And so the hatcheries now produce fingerlings to restock so that there are fish in the dams. And this particular enterprise was experiencing mass mortality events associated with their springtime season, when they would breed their fish. This was unusual for them. They'd been operating for many years prior. What had changed was the change in their neighbours' spraying practices associated with use of a range of agri-chemicals. Their neighbour in this instance was a tree crop macadamia farm, which had also been established for many years, but it changed from being an organic farm into being a conventional farm that utilised pesticides. And it was this change that led to the timing of when we started to see mass mortality events on the fish hatchery. So I began to investigate this problem to try and understand what was the cause of the deaths in both fish larvae, but also in their broodstock fish. Their older fish in ponds were also dying. It became more and more complex. The more we dug into the problem, the more we discovered. It was quite an eye-opening experience for me of the problems that can occur with relatively low exposures to chemicals. It also was an opportunity for me to begin to understand just how little control we have about where chemistry goes when we try and apply it to agriculture. It taught me much about spray drift and allowed me to meet some impressive individuals who'd been working with spray drift and trying to help control it. These were people like Professor Andrew Hewitt, who's an expert in spray drift globally. Now, looking at this problem, we started to look at whether or not it could be possible to even spray safely at the neighbouring property. And it turned out in much of the area, it would be very difficult to spray, certainly on the edge of the crop closest to the fish hatchery. It would be almost impossible to stop some drift moving over the fence and exposing the fish. What we found when we started to investigate was signs of deformity. These were changes in the development of the fish embryos in the earliest part of their life. And sometimes they didn't even survive to hatch out of their eggs. Where they did, some of them were deformed. And we saw this very high mortality rate of fish just simply not making their way through larval rearing. This was very unusual. When we started to look a little wider, the problem wasn't confined actually just to fish. There was a horse on the property that developed muscle tremors that were consistent with organophosphate poisoning. The horse was administered an antidote to organophosphate poisoning, a chemical called atropine, and the horse responded. So it was strongly suggestive that the horse had been exposed to this. Now, there were pigs on the property. The pigs aborted their piglets mid-term. This was unusual. There were chickens on the property, and the chickens had deformed toes. So their toes were bent. This was odd. When you go into the literature, you can see that when eggs become exposed to organophosphates, some of this was very old information published back in the late 50s and early 60s, when organophosphates became a product that began to be used after the Second World War as a crop protection product. And what these chemicals are able to do is interfere with the development of animals. They interfere with the signaling that the cells are talking to each other with. So when an embryo is becoming organized, it starts off just as this tiny, tiny little thing, microscopic, with just a couple of cells. And these cells divide and move from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 cells as the animal begins to develop. Those cells then need to organize from starting off of just being a blob to turn into a complicated creature that includes all the features we'd expect of eyes, internal organs. So the cells need to work out where to go, and they talk to each other using chemical signals. And it appears that it's these chemical signals that become interfered with. The communication between the cells is disturbed, and so the animals become deformed during development. And some of those deformities may be so critical the animal does not thrive. We saw changes to the heart of these animals as they were developing, seeing inflammation around the heart and swelling around the heart of the larvae. We investigated about other possible causes, because it's very important when you're doing these types of investigations to fish kills to start with the most open mind, that all possibilities need to be on the table. This would include things like infectious diseases, viruses, bacteria, and parasites. All need to be considered before you necessarily land on a conclusion. So in this case, we ruled all of those other possibilities out. We used pathology through the state government laboratory to show that there was no virus involved. And we also had monitoring of water quality to ensure there wasn't a water quality issue based on an oxygen level, for example. These were all suitable. The thing that kept coming out of the analysis was this timing in relation to the spray application on the neighbouring property. This was a real light globe moment for me, Beverley, in my career, because this wasn't something that had been taught to me at veterinary school. It was science, it existed, but it existed in the peer-reviewed literature. There were bodies of science. Once I started looking, I found, oh, there's this thing called endocrine disrupting chemicals. This was a new phrase to me at the time, and but it clearly wasn't new to everybody. It turned out people had been publishing about endocrine disruption for many years. Some of it started back in the late 90s, where people were observing whelks. These are shells, snails, if you like, that live around harbours, around commercial harbours, and they found that the female shells were developing male genitalia. So this was very abnormal. They called it imposex, like intersex, but in shellfish, this particular condition was referred to as imposex. And they traced it to the exposure to a contaminant, which was an anti-foulant paint utilizing a heavy metal called tributyl tin, or TBT. This has since been phased out after it was recognized that it leached off the boat hulls and it moved into the environment. And you could actually see a gradient of the whelks. Those that were closest had the most and the highest rate of imposex. Importantly, though, it collapsed the population because the animals couldn't breed properly. The normal reproduction between males and females was disturbed. And so the whelk populations close to harbours collapsed. And you could see this trend of the amount of imposex, the rate went down the further away you got from the contaminant source. So it was pointing strongly to the involvement of this contaminant, and it was subsequently proved up in laboratory studies. There was much more that came after this in other areas of research that I came across. The work of people like Susan Jobling, a professor in the UK who studied the Thames River and the populations of roach in that river, a native fish to that area. And they were changing internally, reproductively, they were changing. The female fish, the male fish rather, were becoming feminized or demasculinized. So this was a process where an observation looking internally at the gonads of the fish. Now, in that species, the males should have a testis and the females should have ovaries. So it is a male and female split of the genitalia in that particular species. What Susan Jobling started to find was that there were intersex fish. These were male fish with a testis, but they were growing eggs in their testicles. They were growing ova. So these were becoming hermaphroditic fish. These fish also were not able to reproduce in the same way that healthy fish were. Now, this was attributed to wastewater emissions coming into the waterway. And the things that were in the wastewater included substances that were disrupting the hormones of the fish. So this word endocrine disruptor is a word for hormones. So it's not just our sex hormones like estrogen or testosterone. In fact, our bodies run with a whole suite of different hormones. Indeed, all animals operate with the use of these fantastic little molecules called hormones or endocrine substances. They're things like insulin that control our glucose in our body. They're things like thyroid hormone that allow our metabolism to go faster or slower. They're things that influence our ability to feel that we're full after a meal. The satiety reflex is hormones moving from our gut back to our brain to tell us we've had enough to eat, we've got enough nourishment. All of these signals that operate our bodies are becoming disturbed by exposure to complex exposures of chemicals. Now, after Susan Jobling's work, there have been some very seminal works published explaining how widespread this issue of endocrine disruption is. Studies in the US looking at alligators found that male alligators' penises were getting shorter, so short that they weren't able to copulate with their partner alligators and causing declines in alligator populations. This was traced to contamination in the wetland areas and their food webs. So we had fish affected, we had gastropod snails affected, we had alligators affected. We had the work that was produced by Rachel Carson in the 60s when she wrote her seminal book, Silent Spring, showing that pesticides were affecting birds of prey and other animals. The science kept coming and people like Theo Colburn were publishing about contamination in the Potomac River and the effect on fish causing intersex there. Different contaminants, but acting on these sensitive hormone systems of the body, modifying the health of the animals. So this really became a journey of great discovery for me, Beverley, after my first hand seeing it in the fish developing on this fish hatchery. I realised that I needed to be looking much harder at all of the cases that I was seeing to see the complex role of contaminants in animal health.
Wow, this is so tragic, especially when you mentioned that since the late 50s, 60s, you know, people were talking about this, and you did great work back in 1980s that you just discussed. And also when you mentioned fish kill, my alarm bells went off, because last year, as you know, we're traveling around in a camper van, and that terrible meninge fish kill. And, you know, they said, oh, no, it's not from chemicals. But then I think it was the Griffith University or independent people in the area tested it, and there was a lot of deadly chemicals in the water. What do you think was going on there?
Yes, so Menindee is one of these areas where it takes you have to take a very broad look at causation. So the cameras first found the dead fish in the Menindee Weir Pool. Now, it's part of the Murray-Darling system, our largest river system in Australia, but it's a very disturbed river system. It's disturbed because we've put barriers all the way along it, hundreds and hundreds of barriers to fish movement. These are in the form of weirs and different structures that have been put in place mostly to support agriculture at times. And these structures are partly being put in place to allow agricultural extraction of water. Sometimes have been put in place for town water supply, sometimes for recreation or multi-use. But what they have done is they've profoundly changed the way water moves down the system. The Murray-Darling is a very disturbed system because of the amount of water that we extract from the system to move on to irrigation agriculture. It's a very disturbed system because we used it initially as a highway when we didn't have a highway. It was used for boat traffic. And to get paddle steamers up and down the river, they needed to remove many of the snags, the logs, the old timber that had fallen in the river to allow passage for these boats. Removing logs from rivers has an impact on the river. It removes fish habitat that fish need to breed on. It also changes the way water flows. Logs create little eddies. They create turbulence in the water, and they slow the water down. Now, when we put in place all these barriers, we did cut off connectivity in many areas of the catchment where fish could no longer get back up to where they came from. If it flooded, they might have a chance, but if it didn't flood, they couldn't get through all these barriers. Now, the barriers also caused pools of water to form that weren't flowing, and flowing water behaves very differently to stagnant water in a pool. It particularly becomes a problem once we start adding the way we do farming presently into the mix. So the landscape above the waterway is what generates the water in the river. So when it rains, the rain is touching down on the catchment, and depending what it lands on and what that water comes across, it makes its way into the river either via surface flow, and some of it makes its way via groundwater movement, where it goes into the landscape and comes back out in the river. So now the current agricultural system that we operate is completely dependent upon pesticide use to control pests in monoculture cropping, and completely dependent upon synthetic fertilizer use to provide nitrogen to give production performance to the crops. Now, these two materials that are used in these systems, they both have their origin in fossil fuels. Fertilizer is predominantly made via gas, and the pesticides are outputs of the oil and gas industry. Something like 99% plus of our pesticides are derivatives of the oil and gas industry, to understand where these things come from. Now, when we apply them to these landscapes, what we see is that we have a small amount of the fertilizer use gets used by the plants. Around about 20 to 30% maximum of the nitrogen gets used by the plants. The rest of that nitrogen, unfortunately, either runs off or moves into groundwater, and some of it stays in the soil, and a bit of it moves into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which then can fall back to Earth with rainfall again. Now, what we're doing with all of this nitrogen that we're making is we are driving up the amount of available nitrogen in these systems. Now, from the plant producer's view, this was viewed as a revolution, that we would be able to grow more food because we had more nutrient. The problem is that the nutrient doesn't stay where we put it. It doesn't stay in the paddock. It doesn't all be used by the plants. In fact, the minority is. Where we find that nutrient is in the waterways. And that amount of nutrient entering our waterways has a profound negative impact on the health of the aquatic ecosystem. Too much of this nutrient promotes blue-green algal blooms. These are toxic algae in our waterways. And we now see along the length of the Murray-Darling and in most of the reservoirs, periodic blooms of these blue-green algae at levels that make the water unsafe to drink. So it puts a cost on our potable water supply. It makes the water unusable for some of our graziers, where stock can't even drink the water due to the blue-green algal toxicity. The problem doesn't end there. The blue-green algae themselves are not as nutritious for fish. So the earliest life stages of fish, so when our native fish spawn, their larvae are very small, and part of their early nourishment is from consuming algae, which are at the bottom of this aquatic food web. They're, if you like, the tiny little solar panels in the water that are grabbing the sun's energy and converting it using this magic process of photosynthesis to generate proteins and lipids and carbohydrates inside the algal cells. This is the very construction of the first primary nutrients of life are entering these systems, and the algae are helping us transfer the energy from the sun into then the next stage of life, which is zooplankton. These are microscopic crustaceans, incredible numbers of them in water. If you take a drop of water from the river, you can often see these microscopic crustaceans under the microscope. They look like creatures from some sort of a sci-fi movie. They really are, they look scary. If they were big, they would be. But these are microscopic particles in the water, and they form this magnificent food source for early life stages of our larger aquatic species like fish, like yabbies, another crustacea in our systems. They're essential, but they don't particularly like blue-green algae as a food source. And so what we see when we see this excessive amount of nutrient moving into systems is a shift, a big shift in the type of algae present. We lose diversity and we get this domination of the system by a toxic algae. So this has a net negative effect for the whole aquatic ecosystem. Often these blooms become so dense that at night time, when the blooms are not receiving sunlight to give them energy and oxygen, they deplete the oxygen from the water bodies and cause the oxygen level to go so low that there's not enough oxygen left in the water to even support the fish that are present. This is part of how the fish at Menindee died. They ran out of oxygen. The oxygen levels collapsed in the river. This isn't natural. This isn't something that happens in a river where we haven't disturbed the catchment. It happens as a result of too much nutrient being in the river. But there's other components to the story, and this is the complexity that's easy to skip over. But it's important to understand. There's other things in the water that have made the water body less stable. By having dense blooms of algae, there's not much light reaching the floor of the river anymore. So our native plants that used to live in these areas and form a controlled, they held together the sediments of our rivers, and they formed habitat for different creatures in there. So turtles and platypus and different juvenile stages of fish and shrimp and yabbies lived in these habitats. They were critical. When you shade them out, it's like pitching a tent on your lawn if visitors came to visit at Christmas time and they stayed a bit too long. The grass under the tent dies. And this is what's happened as we've shaded out much of the life on the floor of the river. This has destabilized the floor of the river. We've also destabilized the riverbanks by allowing cattle in, and in many places from our clearing and our removal of snags, we've taken away the native vegetation that holds the riverbank together. If we don't hold it together with tree roots and deep-rooted native plants, the riverbanks begin to erode, and much of that sediment starts moving down the catchment and through the rivers. This sediment blocks the light penetration in the water, smothers these populations of plants on the floor of the river, smothers the mussels, and impedes the functioning of this ecosystem. We have too much sediment in there. So we have too much nutrient, too much sediment. Then we have these pesticide issues where we're applying herbicides to many of our cropping systems. They're referred to in the industry as crop protection products. But the herbicides don't stay put. And those herbicides move into the river.
This is all so scary. And, you know, if it's doing that to the fish, what is it doing to human health? The same with what you mentioned earlier about the sex changing in the fish and other animals. What is it doing to human health?
Well, the implications here, as a veterinarian, it's a good training base to understand comparative medicine, because humans are just another animal to me. They're a complex animal, but they're just another animal. And in fact, our blood is very similar to fish blood. Our liver is very similar to fish liver. In fact, fish are so similar to humans, Beverley, that we now use them as an experimental animal to test pharmaceutical products on. We use them as an animal when we're exploring diabetes, as they are a suitable animal to look at trialing, to see the responses, how they respond to different triggers. So this is how close we are to fish. Is we have these many influences coming into the river of nitrogen, of sediment, and pesticides like herbicide coming into the river. These exposures are complex, so it's multiple things. It's not one thing. It's multiple things at the same time. Now, in people, in humans, it's a similar story, because we have very complex exposures in our life now. And if we trace the root of many of these exposures, they are back to this fossil fuel petrochemical industry. This is the industry that manufactures plastics. These are a product of gas. It's the things that are in plastic. There are many thousands of chemicals that are put into the plastic polymer to give the polymers the utility that we've found so tremendously useful. It's fair to say our responses to plastic are a thing of addiction. But what we've done is we go, this is so convenient, I just can't stop using it. And so plastics have embedded themselves quite literally in our lives, but they're now embedded in our bodies. We're ingesting plastic in our food. We have plastic throughout our ecosystem. So it's inside fish, it's in our soil, it's in our air, and it's in our bodies. We know it's in our brains. We know it's in the placenta of babies. We know it's in breast milk. We know it's in sperm. This is where science has taken us with the plastic story, and the plastic chemicals are in our bodies. We know if we test urine, we can often identify some of these plasticizers. These are chemicals like things called phthalates, or people might be familiar seeing on plastic labeling the letters BPA, or bisphenol A is what that stands for. This is a plasticizer that helps plastics have these properties about whether they're soft and flexible or hard and rigid. These are chemicals that are added to the process, but they don't stay put in the plastic. They leach out of the plastic. They move into living things, and they act like hormones. They are able to mimic the way that hormones act. There's many different ways they're operating, not just a single pathway, not just like a lock and a key. Sometimes they can be the key. Sometimes they can block the lock. Sometimes they can work in other ways as well. So it's complex the way these things are interfacing with the operation of our bodies. But what we're seeing in humans is a very clear signal that our reproduction is failing. What we see is that our sperm count in men is declining. We have seen sperm count declines in men from the 1970s through till now of nearly 50% declines in sperm count in men. And this is in multiple countries around the world from very large data sets. And the decline hasn't stopped. It's in fact accelerating. Since the 2000s, the rate of decline has been going at better than 2% a year. Now, people find this astonishing because mostly they see it, look around the world and they say, there's so many people, population's booming. What are you talking about? But in fact, our reproduction rate is declining and declining very sharply. Australia's population is only growing because of immigration. It's not growing based on our own birth rate. In fact, we'd be declining quite sharply if it was not for immigration. What we see is not restricted to males, although there's some other data in men that I think is worth mentioning. When people ask the question, what evidence do you really have that males are being impacted? Well, there's two things I would point to. One is a deformity in boys. This particular deformity is of the outlet of the urinary tract. So this is called the urethra, and it normally exits at the very tip of the penis. This is where the urethra, the cells are programmed during development to form, that the outlet will be in this location. When each boy is born, there's a medical check of the child to ensure where is the outlet of the urethra. The reason that doctors are checking this is because the rate of deformities where the outlet is no longer at the tip, but is in fact down the shaft or towards the base of the penis, this is a deformity that can require early surgery for that child to try and correct this anatomical deformity. Now, the rate of hypospadias, they call this condition hypospadias, so a misplacement of the outlet of the urethra. Now, the rate is going up at 1% a year in boys. Now, this isn't the result of improved diagnostic tests. People might say, oh, look, we're just getting better at finding disease. We've got new analytical tests. Well, actually, it's not very hard. You don't need a particularly fancy analytical test to see where the outlet of the urethra is. This physical deformity is going up. But it's not the only change. We're seeing the distance between the anus and the base of the scrotum of men is actually shortening. So, and we see this association is tied to other things, where we see the conditions like hypospadias or this shortened anogenital distance, we call it. We see that those people have lower sperm counts. They have lower fertility. They also have an elevated risk of diabetes. They have an elevated risk of other endocrine diseases. So we see what we're beginning to understand is that the whole of this person's endocrine system has been disturbed during development. There was some excellent work done by a scientist called Professor Shana Swan, who worked with some of the plasticizers like phthalates and showed very clearly in animal models, if you exposed rats to them, that you would create these same conditions. The anogenital distance would shorten if you exposed the rat during its pregnancy to phthalates. Suddenly the fetus would come out looking different and being different. Its whole metabolism was different for life. We've seen this in fish studies with things like obesity. People would be aware that there's talk of an obesity epidemic. It might be blamed on social or cultural phenomena, like we spend too much time looking at the TV, we're on Netflix too much, or we're not doing enough exercise, or we're eating too much junk food. These are things that are put forward and people would say that's why we're getting fat. But there's more to the story. It's not to say they're not involved, but it's more complicated. What we're seeing is that in fish studies, you can expose fish, take the same fish during incubation, so during their early life development, expose one group to some complex persistent organic pollutants. These are chemicals like PCBs and dioxins, which are byproducts of pesticide manufacture and byproducts of burning things like fossil fuels like coal and oil. These are byproduct chemicals of the petrochemical industry. They're byproducts of incineration of plastics. Now, these fish, if you take one group and expose them and have another group that's not exposed, you rear the animals up, these zebrafish, experimental fish, and then you feed them exactly the same amount of food. What happens is the exposed group become obese on the same food, the same diet, with no TV screens, no video games, no lack of exercise. They become obese. Their metabolism has changed. It has been modified by the exposure to toxic chemicals during development. So we understand this is able to be induced in fish. Of course, we're not able to undertake these types of studies on humans due to ethical reasons. We don't work on human embryos for ethical reasons. But what we see is this tremendous commonality, is that if we do the same study in a frog or in a rabbit, we start seeing parallel outcomes. This gives us quite some confidence that in fact what we're seeing in humans is the same, a complex result of a cocktail of exposures to many different compounds. We talked a little about plastics, but it's much more than plastics. It's things like cosmetics that are applied to our faces. They may be sunscreens. Some of the chemicals that were utilized in sunscreens, things like oxyphenones, benzophenones, these are compounds that are also hormone active substances. So when we absorb them through our skin, they can modify our metabolism. They can modify our normal hormone signaling, and particularly if they're applied to the skin of a pregnant woman. The blood of that lady is shared with her fetus through the umbilical cord. And we know now that if we take blood from the umbilical cord of a woman and test it for all of the chemical substances in the blood, we can find upwards of 200 anthropogenic chemicals, man-made chemicals, in that blood being shared with that fetus. It's true to say that there is now no unexposed people on the planet. In fact, there's no unexposed anything on the planet. No unexposed plants, animals, people, insects, anything. Everything is getting some level of exposure now. And because of our continual expansion of use, the exposure profiles are going up. Now, initially, I've got some good friends who are engineers, and they worked in the wastewater industry, many different areas of engineering. But in wastewater, very much part of the maxim of wastewater is the solution to pollution is dilution. If we just dilute it low enough, she'll be right. We won't have an impact. And this is how we've treated many of our areas of our ecosystem as a dumping ground. We've dumped our effluent into the ocean, hoping that, well, there's enough water in there, it'll dilute out the problem. We now take our wastewater and the solids. When we separate solids from wastewater in the sludge ponds, we take that wastewater sludge, which we've renamed biosolids to make it seem less scary, and we take the biosolids, about 3/4 of what we produce, and we now spread that back onto agricultural paddocks. We say, oh, it's great, it contains phosphorus, it's an excellent nutrient for plants. What we don't think enough about is all the other things that are embodied in that material. In wastewater and in the biosolids are, of course, plastics. They come from our clothing. People would know this intuitively, that if they keep washing their clothing, it gets thinner. The particles move out of the clothing, it wears out. Now, where do the particles go? Well, the particles of plastic from your polyester or your polar fleece clothing or your other synthetic clothing, they move down straight through our washing machine. We don't filter them at the washing machine. They go to our wastewater treatment plant and they get captured in the sludge ponds. Because we keep banging them against each other and filtering them, they get smaller and smaller. They go from micro to nanoplastics, but they don't disappear. There's no away for these materials. They don't go away. They just are moved around, and then they end up entering into food webs. What we see, I was across in China just before COVID, and some scientists up at Ocean University there were looking at what happens if you put into water plastic particles and you cover them with a fluorescent labeling dye, so they glow in a fluorescent light. And you put the equal amount of plastic particles into a tank as algae. So there's 50-50 algae and plastic particles. The algae are a natural food source for the zooplankton. And then so you add some zooplankton into the tank and say, okay, guys, go and eat what you'd like to eat. Now, it turned out the zooplankton ended up ingesting more plastic than they did algae. The plastic was the right size, and the zooplankton were confused. It wasn't food. It wasn't algae after all. They'd eaten a piece of plastic. We're able to see that. When we put a fluorescent light on them, you could see the zooplankton lit up with this fluorescence of the plastic particles inside the zooplankton. Now, the zooplankton in that study were still alive. They didn't die immediately. But what they didn't do was grow. Plastics are not a food source. And so the amount of zooplankton, they didn't grow nearly as much as those in the tank with just the algae alone. So we lost all this productivity. We lost all this growth that should be happening in our ecosystems naturally as these natural systems operated. But the growth was robbed from these animals because they'd consumed plastic particles. There is no away for these compounds. And we are continuing to accelerate our production of things like plastics. And we are putting them into our food systems. We use plastic films to wrap up our bales of silage. We use plastic to go along the rows of blueberries and strawberries to keep the weeds, suppress the weeds, and control irrigation losses. Within the paddock, these can seem like great efficiencies, that we've improved something. We've got more strawberries per hectare, or we've used less water. But we're not thinking at the right scale, Beverley, about this, because the plastic has to go somewhere. And it does. It's going everywhere. And the same is true of some of our pesticides. They move and they cause unfortunate effects that we didn't predict. Pesticides appear super useful when we put them into a paddock where a pest is eating a crop. And suddenly we're able to kill the pest, the crop survives, we harvest the crop, our yield is up, and we say, yes, that's a success. But what we haven't measured is the movement of that chemical off the paddock into the river. What is it doing there? Well, if it's a herbicide, it's still being a herbicide. In the river, the aquatic plants include these microalgae. So these microscopic algae are plants. They get impacted by the herbicide. It tends to favour some algae that are more tolerant to the pesticides, and the ones who aren't tolerant, they die out. It turns out that things like blue-green algae are quite tolerant to herbicide. It turns out they like things like glyphosate. So glyphosate, in its backbone, has phosphorus. So as it breaks down, it releases more phosphorus into the water, adding to this issue of eutrophication, or too much nutrient in the waterways. So glyphosate, which is our largest chemical use in terms of volume in Australia, a vast amount is used. We use vast amounts of agrochemicals in Australia. Billions of dollars of agrochemicals are used. People need to appreciate that the volume of use is going up, not a little bit. We've doubled our total chemical use in the last decade. Doubled. This is a colossal increase in the amount of pesticide applied into the environment. We know from research that people living adjacent to agriculture have a different health outcome. Now, there's many questions. Why would this be so? Is it because they're in the sun more? Perhaps this is causing more sun cancer. Is it because they're more likely to breathe in diesel fumes from a diesel tractor? Possibly. But what we're beginning to see is there's a series of complex exposures that change risk. What we see is the rates of things like neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's are substantially elevated in our rural communities. Not a little bit, a lot, sometimes up to 8-fold higher than in communities that don't have the same exposure profile. Parkinson's is not a pleasant disease. There's nobody that would have Parkinson's on their bucket list of, gee, I wish I had that. It's a terrible disease, but it's not the only one. We're also seeing diseases like motor neuron disease, another neurodegenerative disease, elevate, particularly in some of these agricultural areas. Some of the science is showing how this happens. There's many ways it appears to create things like Parkinson's disease. It's not one thing causing the problem. It's many pathways can lead to this damage inside the brain that then impairs the ability of the brain to operate. Now, pesticides are very, very strongly implicated in inducing Parkinson's disease. There is abundant evidence now in the peer-reviewed literature. However, we have not seen a public policy response in the use of these chemicals to control it, to prevent it. That response has not happened. Now, this is perturbing, to say the least, where you have health scientists saying, look, I've got some strong evidence here. It's not certain, but it's strong evidence that we are causing harm to our human health population. This is costing us significant amounts of money. Not trivia, tens of millions to billions of dollars of lost public health money. For people with Parkinson's are not able to work in the workforce anymore. We have to support them. We need to give them medical care. There are medical costs associated with the care. We try and provide pharmacy to help these people live a better life. It's not the only disease, though, that we're seeing escalating. And the escalations of Parkinson's, it's the fastest growing neurological disease in the world. It's not a flatline rate. It's going up multiple % a year in the population. This can't be explained just by the fact that we've got an aging population. That doesn't explain it. It's going up faster than that. So what we're seeing is escalations of many things, like cancers. And people might say, oh, well, people are getting old, and when you get old, you get cancer. Actually, we've got pretty good data on cancers, as it turns out. We've got public health data collected about the types of cancer, the age at which people get cancer. Young people are getting cancers at the highest rates that they've ever got them, ever. This should be disturbing. This should be leading scientists to ask the questions of why is this so? Why would the cells of the human body no longer remain in order and become cancerous, out of control, replicating, causing damage to organs and eventually causing death? Why would this be so? Why is it that rates of childhood leukemia are going up, and why would they be highest in rural areas? These are really good science questions to ask for the inquiring mind. And when you dive into the literature, you begin to see that there are linkages made to pesticide exposure and other toxicants. These toxicants impacting on the health of our bodies. It is the total sum of the toxicants that's affecting us. It's not just one. And this is the complexity and the great difficulty in trying to do something about it. I think if it were just one chemical, it might be removed from the market and swiftly we would expect to see an improvement. But that's simply not the case. For these exposures are complex, coming by food, from residues in our food, from plastics embedded in our food, coming via air. We're inhaling some of these compounds when we're living in our home, coming off our flooring. If we have vinyl flooring, there will be vapors. Some people are putting chemicals into their houses as fragrances coming out of the wall plug. These are chemicals like phthalates used to carry the fragrance. Perfumes they may be applying to their body. These are also petrochemicals, and these are also causing exposures. Things like cosmetics, mention sunscreens. These are the types of chemicals that penetrate our skin, and they can influence and add together and interact with other chemicals that we've got on board and interfere with our hormone systems and also interfere with our immune system. This is the part of our body that protects us from getting sick, or it responds when our body becomes damaged. If we cut our finger, we will have an inflammatory response to try and repair the cut in our finger. When bacteria might enter that cut and begin to infect the tissue, our body will try and fight them off and heal that wound. That's what the body will do. But if the immune system is impaired, it might not do a very good job. What we're seeing is that pollution is impairing our immune system. This is part of why people during COVID in Western Sydney had higher rates of COVID. They were breathing in more air pollution. The air pollution was damaging their lungs. It was making it easier for the virus to get into their bodies. Air pollution is in fact the highest cause of death globally. Few people would appreciate that, but air pollution is a tremendous problem. And much of that air pollution, if we look at where is it coming from, it is derived from fossil fuels. So we see this very common thread through our lives, that this has been both the most useful and amazing thing to discover all of this energy. It's so dense, so easily transported, so powerful, so useful, but simultaneously, there are all of these externalities which are coming back to haunt us. They're affecting all parts of the ecosystem health, including our own. So life is very integrated, as it turns out. We don't live above the ecosystem, we live within it. We can't avoid exposure. We can't avoid exposure even if we're rich. We still get exposure. We do see that the poor often have more exposures. The poor are often living next to the more polluted areas. The poor often have an unequitable share of the pollution exposure. And so they often have even more impacts than the rich. But no one gets away free. What we're seeing is impacts right across the populace, and these are serious and very, very expensive.
Oh my God, you covered so much and it's really scary. And I know when I interviewed Therese Kerr many years ago, she got Hashimoto's disease from putting cosmetics on her skin. But it's really scary to think that you put on cosmetics and it's affecting your fetus if you're pregnant, and then nobody is safe. And I know when we spoke last, Matt, you mentioned that Australia is one of the only countries in the world that hasn't banned any chemicals in the last 30 years. So why do you think that is, especially when it's affecting our health? And you got the NDIS, autism is the highest it's ever been, and ADHD and many other childhood illnesses.
Yes, so Australia has an interesting regulatory system, and it's not dissimilar to other regulatory systems around the world. So we have many similarities. It's important to understand that the construction of these regulatory systems, their original genesis, was that they were formed to support the use of chemicals. They weren't formed to stop the use of chemicals. They're actually to facilitate the use of chemicals. To make people feel comfortable about that idea, they introduced these, I guess you would call them motherhood statements, that our aim in part of the pesticides regulation is to protect human and environmental health. That sounds great. Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, they utilise a risk assessment. So they try and work out What is the hazard? So what could this chemical do? What could it cause harm to? What kind of exposures could be happening? They try and estimate exposure because in Australia, there's no exposure data. So we don't collect exposure data on any of these chemicals. We don't have a biomonitoring program. We're at the very, very beginning of starting a biomonitoring program for contaminants, but it's only just starting now. We're a long way down the road. For those of us who've already been born and are living our lives, we are already experiencing these exposures. Now, from these exposures, the kinds of harm we are seeing is really widespread, and this is where the regulation is not keeping up. For some of the diseases, we don't even have them on our list of priority diseases, so we don't collect data on them. So things like Parkinson's is a non-lethal and a non-communicable disease. Currently, we're not collecting enough granular data about where it is and why it might be high here or high there, what age people are getting it at. A lot of that data is still not being well assembled because of the system we have. Now, in these risk assessment processes that the regulator sets up, the risk assessments require data. Now, the data that they use mostly comes from the people seeking to register the product. Those people have a financial interest in the product being registered. That represents somewhat of a conflict of interest. Whilst they're required to supply to the regulator negative studies if the studies show that the product is not safe or may not be effective, the regulator asks for those studies, but now we're expecting a business who may profit from the sale of a chemical to do the right thing. This is something called trust, which is a bit old school. We're requiring a lot of trust. There isn't a process being undertaken to ensure that that trust isn't broken, that people haven't lied. Now, we can explore this a little bit, and we've had the chance through some of the US court cases to see whether or not companies who make pesticides might lie, or might not tell the whole truth, or might not supply all of the information to the regulator. We've seen recently around these chemicals called the PFAS chemicals, the perfluorinated alkylated substances. These PFAS chemicals that are used in so many materials that are, you may find them in a Gore-Tex jacket, you may find them in the Teflon lining of your fry pan, you may find them in tires of cars. So many, many places PFAS chemicals are used. What we know now is that some of the harms of these chemicals were known by the company 3M years and years before they began to change their production. They didn't necessarily give all of the information to the regulator. We know that some of it was simply withheld. It was withheld. One must wonder why. The motive perhaps was profit. Profit seems to be quite a powerful incentive in a capitalist economy to drive human behaviour. And so what we see is that sometimes the information that our regulator might be trying to do their best with is incomplete. They don't have all the numbers. And in fact, if you're a good scientist, you ought to be humble. You ought to accept that you don't know everything, and it's hard to know everything, and we probably will never know everything, which requires us to be cautious because we might overlook something that we don't know. Now, our systems that we have for things like pesticides in Australia, they overlook endocrine disrupting chemicals. They overlook that as an end point. It's not an end point that most of them have ever been assessed for. In fact, Australia's pesticide regulation system doesn't even check if we learn anything. So let's say, Beverley, we registered a chemical back in 1970. We used 1970s knowledge back when we were just about to put a seatbelt in a car. We certainly didn't have any anti-locking brakes. We didn't have airbags in the car in 1970. Now, in 2025, we've got airbags in cars. We've got seatbelts, we've got sensors, we've got all manner of things that are stopping us having collisions and damage and harm to your health, death. In the pesticides industry, we still haven't yet designed a seatbelt. We're using the same system for that chemical. We've applied none of the new knowledge to that chemical. In fact, it hasn't been reviewed. We have chemicals that we haven't reviewed for years and years. We haven't taken the knowledge that has come out about what I found when I started exploring. Look at that. Gee, endocrine disrupting chemicals, that's the thing. Look at that. They interfere with cell division. Oh, they interfere with hormone levels. Oh, they cause chronic diseases, long-term effects that take a long time to express. Gee, I wasn't aware of that. Well, none of that was published too much in 1970. So we have learned things, but we haven't applied them to the chemical regulatory system. It is lagging desperately, desperately behind. Now, there are people who make a lot of money by it not improving. The medical system, well, is it a health system or is it a sickness system, one must ask. We are generating an ever-expanding list.
Carry on, Matt.
There's an ever-expanding list of pharmaceuticals on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. That's an ever-expanding amount of Australia's gross product, domestic product that's going into pharmaceuticals. Not into the health of Australians, not into the health of their environment. In fact, it's creating more pollution. Pharmaceuticals are another thing that we find in our waterways now, not by intention. We didn't think it was a good idea to give fish antidepressants. So with heading towards a quarter of the population taking antidepressants to try and make their brain feel better, many of those we now find if we test in the water downstream of a wastewater plant. The effluent flowing into the sea or into the river contains antidepressants. There's enough antidepressant there that some of the fish change behaviour. Some of our little fish, like gudgeons, they lay eggs in a nest onto the floor of the river. And it's a little different perhaps to human reproduction. In some areas of fish reproduction, the male does some of the work. In this case, the male guards the nest. So after the female has laid her clutch of eggs, the male may stay there on the nest and fiercely defend the eggs against everything that wants to eat those yummy little morsels of eggs. And the male will stay there until the clutch of eggs hatches, and then the young are large enough to look after themselves. What happens if that male fish is exposed to some of these chemicals in wastewater is he says to himself, you know what? I don't think I can be bothered hanging around here. Guarding these eggs is hard work. I might just trot off over here and not be so worried. I can't be bothered being so defensive. I don't wish to be defending all the time. It's aggressive. I don't want to be aggressive. I'm just going to let it go. And what we see is a decline then in the population as the eggs get consumed by other fish, and that gudgeon may decline. These are the subtle causes of fishery decline. Most people think that we just caught them all. They think that, oh, look, it's the nets, it's the fishermen catching them all. That's where all the fish went. But of course, they're not seeing these effects, these subtle effects of chemicals altering behaviour, altering the ability of fish to breed, altering the survival of the earliest life stages, the eggs, unable to hatch. These are the types of things that are collapsing our fisheries right around the world and having a huge impact on our own health because we eat fish, we eat seafood. They're part of some of the most important natural food sources on the planet are seafood. They support millions of people to have high quality protein in their diet. They've supported tremendous amounts of development in our brain. In fact, if we trace some of the origins of the fatty acids in our brain, we can see that we are people of the sea. We've taken those beautiful nutrients that got created in algae, transferred up to zooplankton, into fish, and into our bodies and into our brains. So we are part of the ocean via this transfer of these magical omega-3 fatty acid nutrients that become an important part of our body and our health. So it's a real problem when we see that seafood productivity is declining. that we're not making as much seafood as we should, or should I say nature is unable to produce as much seafood as we should, from our natural systems are being severely impaired. So these are great problems for our time, but I think they come with opportunities.
So for the listeners, how can we help to resolve this situation if the government bodies are not, and the regulators not doing anything about it? How can we protect ourselves? Well, you said we can't because it affects the rich and the poor alike. It's in the air, it's in our water, it's in our food, cosmetics. What's best advice can you give to the listeners?
I think there's many opportunities to engage. Some of them are direct into our government systems. So we're fortunate to live in a democracy where we have representatives in our communities who can take up issues from the community to government. Some of those issues need to change their ordering, if you like. There are relatively few people saying to their local member, I want a better regulatory system. I want a regulatory system. A regulatory system that I want a regulatory system that protects my health. I want a regulatory system that improves the health of the environment, restores the health of the environment, not continues to grind it down. Those simple messages people could impart to their local political members of all stripes. It matters not which political affiliation they have. Everybody wants improved health in their population. People don't wish to see queues at hospitals. People don't wish to have to pay more in a Medicare levy or pay more tax to try and support the ever-growing health budget. People just want to be healthy. So we can give these messages to our politicians so they begin to hear it not just from one voice or two voices, but from hundreds of voices every week. This is an opportunity we have. We can make choices individually. We don't need to continuously buy clothing. We could buy less clothes. We can consume less. This has a huge impact on the amount of resource that's consumed. We can make different choices in our lives about food. We can buy organic food. We can buy food from local farmers that don't utilise chemicals. Agroecological farming is a methodology for producing food that doesn't require pesticide application. We can dramatically reduce pesticide use and still produce food. That's not an if, we definitely can. Countries like France and Germany, I don't think anybody really knows. Those countries have committed at a country level to 25 and 30% of their land area changing away from pesticide-dependent agriculture to agroecological production. A quarter to a third of the countries. Australia is at well under 2% of land area utilised for organic agriculture. We have an opportunity there to change. The European countries are responding to the science. They've brought in much tighter chemical regulation. They've identified that endocrine disrupting chemicals are a serious problem for our health. They're a serious problem for our reproduction. They've recognised that it's not just that women are choosing not to have children. That's not the entire reason the birth rate has declined. Women have had more opportunities to pursue careers. This is a good thing. It's not the only reason, though, that they choose not to have children, because when we look at the data, what we see is that the miscarriage rates in women are rising. We see that the rate of use of assisted reproductive technology is going up. No one voluntarily goes to an IVF clinic. It's not fun. It's not enjoyable. it has profound impacts on the body. These are serious reproductive interventions. They're only happening at such a rate because reproduction has been interfered with. It's now not functioning as it should. It's not just because women are choosing to have children when they're older. An interesting little experiment for people is to take a wander around their local cemetery. And you'll see that going back in time, getting pregnant when you were older as a woman was not a problem, actually. It was very, very much not a problem. Many, many women in their 30s and 40s you'll find in graveyards. They didn't have trouble getting pregnant. They didn't have any surgical obstetrical support. They died in childbirth. Those women in their 30s and 40s you see in graveyards died in childbirth. So they had no trouble conceiving. They didn't need an IVF clinic. But what we see is that at that time, they didn't have the medical support to have a cesarean. It didn't exist. This has changed dramatically, that now conceiving a child is magical. It's incredibly difficult. It's becoming harder and harder to make a fetus want to stay inside the womb of a woman, which is becoming a hostile environment for that fetus due to all of these exposures happening to the fetus. It's interesting, you know, Beverley, I've looked at many, many reports in the news about our changing demographics, our declining fertility rate. And you know what? There hasn't been one that has mentioned this effect of declining biological fertility due to endocrine disrupting chemicals impacting on the health of our bodies and ability to reproduce. None of them mention it. They mention, tough times. It's the cost of living crisis that's causing birth rates to go down. It's very expensive to have children, no doubt. But if you look back to the 1930s depression, when times were an awful lot harder than they are right now, the birth rates then were much higher than they are now. They were well above 2.1. So funny, isn't it, that really hard times aren't actually a full explanation of the problem. And when we see the responses of government around the world, places like Korea have spent billions and billions of dollars incentivizing their populace to have children because their birth rate is so low, their population is literally disappearing. And you know what? It hasn't worked. So if it was that, I don't have enough money to have a child, and the government then gives you lots of money to have that child and you still don't have it, this tells us something about whether cost of living is really driving the problem or if something else is in the mix that we're not talking about. And in that space is this complex cocktail of exposures. So the opportunities for us are to change the dialogue, change the narrative. When people start saying, oh, look, it's just due to women choosing to have children later. It's due to women having careers. Add into that little dialogue, have you heard about endocrine disrupting chemicals? Have you read anything about them? Do you realise that sperm counts are going down 2% a year? Do you realise that miscarriages are going up? Well, they're not going up because women are choosing to have a career. Men aren't choosing to make their sperm count go down. It's not a result of women having a career that men's sperm count goes down. We can think through these problems and we can certainly talk through them. And I think talking is very important. It's why I'm taking the time to talk to you, is that I think we can have these discussions in the community and change the dialogue, change the narrative so we can communicate that we need to change what we're doing. There's a big change in our landscape that must happen, and that's how we farm. We have to change how we do food and fibre. We help incentivise that change as consumers. That's one thing we can do. We can consume things from the systems that are better for our environment. We can purchase from agroecological. We can choose to wear only natural fibres. These are within our reach. This is lowest of the low-hanging fruit. We can get our fruit from the local farmers market where we have them. Not everyone has the luxury of a farmers market, but many areas do, and we can support our local growers. We can take a bag. We can have that bag not be a plastic bag. We can have that bag made of natural fibre, and we can put our items in it. These are things all within our reach. We can not buy a disposable coffee cup. We can just not buy it. We can have our own cup and reuse it. This is the lowest of low-hanging fruit. If we can't think that this is an acceptable thing to do, then unfortunately, I think as a species, we are locking in our own dark destiny. We have to change. It's very, very clear that we are living well beyond multiple planetary boundaries in our ecosystem. It's not just climate change. It's massive increases in chemical emissions that are uncontrollable. We're causing massive toxic algal blooms in our waterways, both freshwater and in the sea. These have tremendous impacts on our aquatic life. They impact on us. We know that some of these algae, if we inhale them, we get sick. We know that out in the Riverina right now, there's a new centre that's been formed with Professor Dominic Rowe and others, looking at motor neuron disease, looking at what combination of effects are causing such a high rate in that area. And some of them that are high on the agenda are blue-green algal toxins. These are inhaled. They don't just sit in the water. You don't have to drink them. They move into the air and you inhale them. If you live near the water, you have more exposure. These pathways are going to be explored with more science, but we already know this is the wrong way to go. We know that eutrophication is a one-way ticket to nowhere. We should choose again, change, and support our farmers to change. It's not about demonising farmers for doing something that they're doing now. Our farmers have largely followed the script. They've listened to the advice that they've got from the Department of Agriculture, who tells them, use pesticides, use fertilisers. They're following the advice they're given. We need to change the advice. We need to support them to change. We need to incentivise them to change. We're very good at it. If you look at Australians in general, we're excellent at following incentives. We have the highest uptake of rooftop solar in the world. How did we do that? Well, we offered an incentive. And people went, you know what? My power bill goes down when I put those up. Great, get them up. Next thing you know, we've got the highest rate of solar PV on the roofs anywhere in the world. We can incentivise other changes, like in agriculture. These are the kind of incentives we need to be putting in place. These are opportunities for us to change quickly, at scale, and materially alter our whole system. If we look at the economics of farming, people might say, well, if we don't use pesticides, if our yield goes down, well, that's a disaster. We won't be profitable. But what if we did true cost accounting? So rather than just calculate the profit within the boundary of the paddock, what if we calculated the profit based on the whole footprint of the product? Now that includes what we might call externalities. This is where, well, if we're going to farm like that and the water that runs off that paddock is now polluted with pesticides and with nutrients and with sediment, what's the cost of that? If I have to filter out the sediment to make that water potable, how much does that cost? Well, that's a cost. What if the dam that is a water supply dam fills up with sediment and now can't hold water? What's the cost of that? What's the cost of treating all these people with Parkinson's disease? What's the cost of a round of IVF? $10,000 here, $10,000 there. What if we put those costs back in the paddock? What if we identify the pathway for those exposures causing those costs? Now we're doing something called true cost accounting. The true cost of the system we choose to produce food and fibre with. I think if we did true cost accounting, we'd find that agroecological approaches are far superior because we'll have a far more abundant fishery. We'll have many more hundreds of tons of seafood being produced that's healthy, nutritious, thriving. We don't even have to do anything to make that happen. Nature makes that happen. We don't farm the ocean. Nature makes it all happen. It's all almost for free. But we've got to facilitate nature to be able to do what it does. And these are changes in our catchment. We can do things like restore wetlands. These are very, very productive habitats. They store carbon. They allow massive biodiversity increases. They allow feeding and breeding areas for many of our other creatures that integrate and maintain our ecosystems in a healthy state. These are opportunities that we have at our local government level. I'm working here in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales with many different groups, with Landcare, with recreational fishers, with other riverkeeper groups, all looking at how do we support improvements to our landscape? How do we help more of our rainfall penetrate into the soil, not run off? How do we get the soil out of our river or keep it on the land? Can we plant more trees? Could we use different types of cropping rather than killing all of the plants on the surface to plant a crop? Could we find a different technique of seeding through the crop? There's opportunities, there's people doing it, but at the moment, it's a minority. It's a very small minority. And so these are great opportunities for us to begin to change and rapidly begin to turn around the system. I think the greatest news is, Beverley, that these natural systems are recoverable. And when we do take the pollution out of them, boom, they come back. Immediately, animals begin to recolonize. Immediately, insects start coming back. Immediately, biodiversity begins springing forth. If you take away the pollution, you bring back life. It comes back naturally. So it is for us to focus on how do we reduce this gigantic pollution footprint that's ever growing and shrink it right back to allow regeneration to begin.
This is wonderful news. And as you know, there's so many pioneers like Peter Andrews, Charlie Massey, Walter Jenney, just to name a few. And they've got evidence in the land by going completely chemical free. Not only is the food more nutritious, it actually more profitable. It yields, 4 or 5 times more. And as we've been traveling in our camper van, we've come across so many organic farmers now. And like you said, what can we do? Write to your politicians, talk to your politicians. It's about coming together as one voice and realizing, that we can make an impact and change the world. Maybe Australia could be the first country to be the global blueprint. But, it amazes me, and it's very disturbing that politicians and the people in charge of these chemical companies, they know that they're vulnerable to all of this Parkinson's and various other diseases. So why can't they put a stop to it?
Well, I think there's some psychological aspects of our makeup, Beverley, as humans, that we're very good at responding to the immediate and the urgent. We're very good at understanding what to do when faced with an immediate emergency. We respond very quickly and with a lot of effort. But for things that are slow onset, for things that are chronic, that creep up on us, we're terrible. We're really good at ignoring them or putting them to the back of our mind and not dealing with them. And unfortunately, this issue of pollution is one that is creeping up on us. It is slow. It is chronic. It is a large number of different chronic conditions that have crept up on us. And so it's not part of our constitution as humans to immediately respond. We don't jump to attention. So in part, we've got to overcome some of our our own psychological composition to take on board these challenges and respond. I don't think it's beyond us, but it's hard for us to respond in this way. But with more dialogue, I think with more awareness, people will begin to see that there's an urgency actually about it, that supporting health in our environment and in ourselves is critical if we want to see any kind of idea of a flourishing future generation, not a sicker generation, not a more mentally depressed population, not a more diseased population. These are things that I don't think we want. And we've got to be careful not to choose them, because right now we're choosing that future. By each choice we make, we're choosing to have a worse future than what could be available to us. So ultimately, I think that opportunity is something that we can respond to. And I certainly hope we do.
Thank you. I definitely will be. We've bought our land and it's all going to be organic, and we can't wait to keep spreading the word. And on that note, where's the best contact for you, Matt?
So my details are all available on the web, Beverley, so people can get in touch there, and I can certainly direct them to some useful resources. One of the groups internationally who's done some terrific work is a group called IPEN. That's IPEN.org. That group sits on multiple different pollution conventions that are set up internationally, trying to deal with these major issues of persistent organic chemical pollution, both industrial and agricultural. They've got many resources on their website, science-based reports collating information. They've got reports on endocrine disrupting chemicals, bring it into a language for common language rather than complicated science language. They've got documents for policy people who are trying to reform and write health policy to improve. They've got guiding documents for those as well. They're active participants on the Stockholm Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, the Basel Convention, and also working hard trying to get the Plastics Treaty to be a meaningful document. So I'd encourage people to check out that website for ipen.org. I think they're a tremendous group of people working there for the public good of the planet.
That's wonderful. So I'd like to thank you for all your words of wisdom and sharing all this information. Thank you for giving up your precious time.
Thanks, Beverley, and enjoy your trip. It seems like a fascinating journey you're on. Good on you.
Thank you.